Welcome to the NCAA's Conversations on Aging and Justice podcast and the final episode of our Ethics in Elder Mistreatment series. In this episode, you'll hear guests from previous episodes share ethical dilemmas that they have encountered or continue to encounter in their work today. We hope you enjoy hearing the perspectives of our guests, Dr. Georgia Anetzberger, Dr. Ron Acierno, Debbie Deem, Kathy Greenlee, Jennifer Spoeri, Lori Smetanka, and Leilani Pelletier.
An ethical issue that I encountered in my work, which I still think about today, relates to the ethical principle of justice. And in this case, it means treating all groups vulnerable to maltreatment fairly. And the years happened to be 1980 and 1981. And at that point in time, I worked as a community planner and, among other things, staffed a committee charged with drafting Ohio's Adult Protective Services law. At two junctures in the process, the committee and I faced challenges in deciding who besides vulnerable older adults should be covered by the legislation as potential victims. In other words, should residents of nursing homes and disabled younger adults be included? The ethical quandary for the committee and me rested on deciding potentially who might receive help and protection and who might not. With respect to nursing home residents, we ultimately decided not to cover them, hoping that the then newly formed long-term care ombudsman program could intervene as needed. And truthfully, we were afraid that the proposed legislation would not be enacted with this provision, given the strength of Ohio's 3 nursing home associations, all of whom would likely oppose the provision. With respect to younger disabled adults, the Senate committee considering our legislation agreed to support its enactment, but only, and I say only, if it was limited to vulnerable older adults. Well, our group wrestled with this request, ultimately agreeing to it, believing that disabled younger adults could be added as future revision to the law. However, and still, nearly 45 years later, and despite 2 major attempts to amend the law to include disabled younger adults, except for those with developmental disabilities, it still hasn't happened. And so, and still I wonder, was it right to at least enable the mandatory reporting of maltreated, vulnerable older adults? Or should we have held out until all 3 potentially maltreated groups were entitled to receive equal protection under the law?
I'm going to say it's the same one over and over again. Beneficence versus autonomy. We want to do something to help somebody, but how much do we restrict their freedoms in doing it? And that's sort of, we make that decision when we're raising adolescents right through now to adulthood. Where is the sweet spot of controlling what a person's doing that might be hurting them and respecting their right to make their own decisions?
If a victim is talking to me, do I report what they're doing to other agencies, whether it's Adult Protective Services or whether it's the family, and what do I keep with confidential? My victims are savvy. They're getting smart on perhaps telling me what they're doing, but they're not telling me that they've sent money, which kind of means, do I file an income report or not? So they learn. They like having me involved. I try to be fun with them. I try not to lecture, all these kinds of things, but they're very savvy, and finding that ethical line of what I do in each situation can be very difficult. But my biggest issue that I have, and I'll just say that I still think about today, is our lack of system response to these folks. Whether it's banking, whether it's legal aid, I dream of having attorneys, of having CPAs, of having just more people, case managers, area agency on aging, volunteer groups, take these folks on, about as volunteers and as well as people to be volunteered to. It's really going to take our nation, and this is an international issue, to get more involved on these things as a system issue.
I have a dilemma I'd like to talk about, and
a very encapsulated experience that has advanced some of my thinking about elder abuse and self-neglect and prevention. What do we do? How do we get upstream? I left Washington in 2016 and returned home to Kansas. I live in Kansas City, and I have a lot of contact with adult protective services in both Missouri and Kansas. And before the pandemic, so we'll just date it around that time, I asked Catherine Sapp, I'll tell you her name, at Missouri, who was doing a lot of their policy work. I said, Catherine, I'm curious about what we missed before APS was ever involved. Would you ask the APS workers in Missouri, what did we miss? Oh, she said, I'd be glad to ask them what we missed. So she did, and they sent me an answer, and there were many, many things on the page, but I only remember the top answer because it was such a non-sexy answer. Advanced care planning. It's like advanced care planning. And the light bulb moment that created for me really frames what I think about prevention. That prevention is not necessarily something new that we haven't thought of, but instead things we know how to do that we do poorly, and that we need to be better at, helping educate people about the value and the necessity of designating a healthcare proxy, that we need to be mindful of the risk of social isolation when we're prioritizing transportation dollars, that prevention is working with a caregiver to help make sure they are aware of their responsibilities with regard to their family members' money, that we need to be better about incorporating prevention strategies into the daily work we do in the field of aging, and even something as mundane and serious as advanced care planning is something that we don't do well enough, and you see it eventually in an APS case.
Early in my APS career, a person was living alone, not able to care for themselves. The house was a mess. They weren't getting medical care, weren't eating well. And the family stepped up. We engaged the family, and this is, they cared for the individual. Then they found out this person had a significant bank account. Didn't look like it from the outside, but they had saved a lot of money. They never bought like a new water heater, things like that. So they started doing repairs to the house, but then began helping themselves to the person's assets. Still caring for the individual, but depleting the funds. We jumped to a guardianship of estate, nominating another family member. So in our defense, we didn't just go for another, legal service provider or something. And we, to stop the bleeding essentially of the bank account. Because this person had upwards of $500,000 in their account, and they lived in a neighborhood that you wouldn't expect that. The older adult was unfortunately not able to appoint a power of attorney. We had several psych evals, and we were one of the APS programs fortunate enough to have a psychologist on staff. So we wanted to get it right. I was praying this person could appoint a power of attorney, which would have been the same person as the guardian. So the family stopped caring for the individual because they were like, well, we don't have assets, or we don't have the access to the money. And the older adult ended up in a nursing home because the other family member was like, I can't move in with them. I think, if my memory serves, they lived out of state, but they ended up in a nursing home. And I still go back and forth. What was the right thing to do in this case? Because they went to the nursing home. The nursing home got all the funds, but the family was there caring for him. The person was happy as could be. The family was back in their life. They didn't know why the family was back in their life, but it presented so many different dilemmas in my mind. Like, in hindsight, I'm not sure if I would have gone for guardianship. But had you looked the other way as they're depleting all the assets, and eventually they would have left anyway? It's so many questions.
I really think that one of the areas that ethically we need to be much more focused on is ensuring that the individual is at the center of any direction for what needs to happen, either to them or for them or on their behalf. And even if we think that they don't completely have capacity, we need to be ensuring we're doing the best we can to get their input in terms of preferences and what's important to them. And I say that because too often, particularly with older adults or people who may be living with cognitive impairments, it's so easy to default to someone else to make decisions on their behalf, and recognizing that sometimes that absolutely is necessary, but it is still really possible for a person living with dementia or cognitive impairment, for example, to express a preference, to express something that still is important to them, to express their dissatisfaction with how care may be provided or something that may be given to them. And to the greatest extent possible, we need to be incorporating that into the care that's being provided and how we support them in their daily lives. That's something that we really need to highlight as an ethical issue and consideration.
The ethical dilemma is truly, for me, focus on finding the right way to balance the issue of capacity determination. Who determines it when? How do we keep on top of it? Because capacity to make an informed decision can be fluid at times. And certainly when we're asking to make decisions, sometimes we're approaching people at their most difficult moment, when they're sick, when they've had a massive change, and we're wanting to force decisions, and it can take time. And people aren't comfortable with that quite a bit. And we need to work those frameworks in. And it's not an easy issue. There's a reason it's my biggest ethical issue, because we don't have a perfect framework for that. And I think we need to get there.
Thank you for tuning in to our series on ethics in elder mistreatment. If you missed any previous episodes on mandated reporting, finances, self-neglect, or surveillance in licensed facilities, please check out our Spotify or YouTube channels to catch up. Thank you so much for joining us.